It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and Joe Dolan.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eatin' Podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eatin' Oh my gosh. I'm not even restarting. I am not even restarting. This is how authentic and genuine we are on this show. I don't know that that's ever happened to me before. But you know what? It's like I tell my daughters. It's like I tell anybody else in life. You just roll with it, okay? Nobody's perfect. Sometimes you mess up. I've only done about a zillion. What is this? Fantasy Feast podcast number 426. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me, Ross? Evidently, I'm not kidding you. It's not. It's the Fantasy Feast podcast. It's presented by FantasyPoints.com. Use the code FEAST to make sure you get the discount. And by the way, that's how you get into the season-long draft against me and Joe Dolan, although you can't really get in anymore because I'm about to announce the last two winners. I am Ross Tucker, by the way, former NFL offensive lineman, 5 teams, 7 years, bunch of podcasts. Tomorrow, we'll have Greg Cosell on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Always a treat, as is, by the way, today's guest, who's got some similarities to Greg Cosell, although he's more on the math, numbers, analytics side. Love KC Joyner. Been following his work for a long time. You go back to the 4-Letter Network and other places. You got to follow him on Twitter at KC Joyner TFS. Casey, thank you so much for coming on the show.
I really appreciate being here.
All right, so Casey Joyner TFS, that's the football scientist, right? Like that's what the TFS stands for?
That is the football scientist. That is.
All right, I like all the books. You have many leather-bound books behind you.
Yes, a lot of football books. I'm an encyclopedia collector when it comes to football books. I must have probably 45 in my collection.
Wow, that is awesome. So before we even I know guys are dying to know who the last two contestants are for the season-long league. So I'll get into that in a second. But for people that aren't as familiar with your work as I am, can you give them the background and what you're doing now?
Background is back in 2003, I decided I wanted to write a Bill James-style football book. And I quit my job, cashed out my 401k, and wrote a book. And about 18 months later, I sent a bunch of copies of it out, and Dr. Z from Sports Illustrated, I happened to find his address. He liked the book. He wrote an article about it for SI.com, and that led to, NFL teams were buying the book. I got a job at ESPN, so all of that happened there, and half the teams have purchased my book since then. I've purchased my book series since then. I've worked for player agents, and I wrote for ESPN for 14 years covering the NFL, fantasy football, college football, the draft, and anything else they asked me to write about. Finally going off of my own now after leaving the 4-Letter Network, and I started my own website called thefootballscientist.com. I've actually been doing that as a side gig since 2004. So I do fantasy football material. I've got my 17th edition of my draft guide this year. And then I also added the stuff I used to write for that network. Now I'm writing that sort of material for my site as part of my paid subscription service.
Very, very cool, Casey. Well, congrats as someone that left the 4-Letter Network to go out on my own. I know it's a little bit intimidating for sure, but ultimately for me, it was rewarding, and it's kind of nice to work for yourself and to try to grow something. It's not easy. Brian and I scrap and claw all the way with things like giving away entries to play in a season-long fantasy league against me and Joe Dolan, as long as you take advantage of our sponsors and or get a subscription to FantasyPoints.com. That's Joe's fantasy site. FantasyPoints.com. Use the code FEAST. The final 2 entries, by the way, Hugo in Quebec City, mainly just because I wanted to have somebody from Quebec City. I think people say Quebec City. I think you're supposed to, when you're up there, it's Quebec. I don't know. Anyway, Quebec City. And then Eric Feldhake, who just went crazy. Fantasy Points, signed up for Harry's, rated all the shows, etc. So those are the last 2 entries. Everybody else, maybe next year, or maybe we'll do something DFS during the season. That would DFS lineup every week. Maybe I need to talk to DraftKings about that. So let's get into it, Casey, because you and I were texting back and forth. You got some really interesting nuggets for this year and opinions with where you're seeing guys getting drafted right now that are extremely relevant right now. One of which is you believe that a lot of Tampa Bay Buccaneers are still undervalued and going too low in fantasy drafts.
I do. If you look at the factors that go into Tampa Bay this year, you've got the talent. You've got Brady, you've got Evans, you've got Godwin, you've got Gronk, you've got Howard, you've got Brate, you've got Ronald Jones. I mean, you've got a ton of talent on that team. And they also have a very highly favorable schedule from what I call a matchup points perspective. So you're looking at, how well people do in getting coverage or how good they are run blocking. They've got favorable schedules in both those areas. One of the most important things to me is something I call fireworks points. Fireworks points is something that measures how likely it is that a team is going to get into high-scoring games. Because high-scoring games, those are being where each team scores 24 more points. Those games account for a big disproportionate percentage of fantasy points scored. You want to get players in those games, obviously. They have some of the highest fireworks points totals in the league, too. You add that to a Bruce Arians offense. And by the way, note on Tom Brady related to this and the Bruce Arians offense, people think he's a vertical passer or if the calls a lot of aggressive vertical passing. The Bucs were second in the league in passes at or inside the 10-yard line last year, too. So when they get in close, they're going to let Brady throw the football a lot. You start adding all those factors together, and I think this is going to be one of the most explosive offenses in the league. And yet I keep looking at these players' grades, and they're all being drafted usually like a round or two later than I think they should based on what their upside value is.
I like it. So that's one good nugget. But now we're going to get into some individuals, and some of these are nice. First of all, Casey, we're all over YouTube now, youtube.com/RossTuckerNFL. And our intern Casey, does an unbelievable job with our social media clips. And I'm just telling you, when we were texting and you said Patrick Mahomes is overrated, I was like, that'll be a good one. That'll be a good one on the social media clip. So you tell me, Casey, why Patrick Mahomes is overrated.
He's overrated in a fantasy sense. I think he's the best player in the NFL from that perspective. If you're talking from a fantasy sense, yeah, I do think he's overrated, and definitely can explain why. Mentioning that fireworks points idea, NFL teams, there have been 24 teams in NFL history that have scored over 500 points. If you put those teams into fireworks contest, again, where each team is scoring 24 more points, you would think those teams would fare well. As a total, they won 59.8% of their games. If you take a couple of teams in there that did exceptionally well, outlier teams in there, the rest of the teams won 55% of their games. It's basically a tossed-up proposition for these high-scoring offenses when they get into, or even these powerful offenses, even when they get into high-scoring games. It's 50-50 prop for them. Andy Reid learned that lesson in 2018 because Kansas City had a terrible record in those fireworks games. So in 2019, he said, I'm going to bring in Spagnuolo. I'm going to shore up the defense. And in the first half of the year, he kept throwing the ball as often as he had. But as the second half of the season came along and Spagnuolo's defense started to gel, Andy started to run the ball more frequently. He would still throw it, and obviously during the playoffs when he got behind, he said, hey, we're going to cut it loose and we're going to play that style of offense. But he gets now to where he passes to get the lead, and then he starts to run to win. And I think what we saw in the second half of the season where they ran the ball a heck of a lot more than they had earlier in the year, and they weren't on pace to throw 600 passes. It's going to be more like 5 to 550 passes if you prorate it over the course of a season. I think that's what they're going to do this year. And if Mahomes is only throwing 500 to 550 times, and their schedule, by the way, is fairly difficult too, both from a fireworks point perspective and from a matchup points perspective, I start to add all those factors together, and I just can't get a path to get this guy to be the number one quarterback. In fact, I rate quarterbacks in fantasy on an overall upside and downside basis. He's 2 overall, 3 upside, 2 downside. I think he's a great fantasy quarterback. I would not take him as number one. I think he has maybe a 2 in 10 chance of finishing as the number one fantasy quarterback in the league, and everybody's drafting him as if he is that.
Wow. I love it, Casey. I love it. All right, let's keep them going. These are good. Cam Newton, still undervalued in your mind?
He is undervalued. I don't understand it because rushing quarterbacks, it doesn't take a lot for rushing quarterbacks to be successful. They have to combine rushing success with pass success. But if you have a lot of rushing success, you don't need quite as much passing success. He's blown away camp. Belichick, I think there was an idea that Cam Newton's not going to fit into the Belichick system, that he's going to push back and he's going to be Meat's first guy. Nope. All the reports coming out say, yeah, he's fitting right in. Stidham is not playing very well, so he's going to play well in that offense. Belichick is going to call for running plays, maybe not as many running plays as what he saw down in Carolina, but Newton's going to run the football. He's going to run the football maybe near the goal line. He's got a good set of receivers around him. You've got a very creative play calling scheme. I keep looking at this going, he's somebody who, if he could rush for 400 yards and 4 or 5, maybe 6 touchdowns, not a ton. I mean, it's a good number for quarterbacks. We're talking for Cam Newton, that's not a huge volume. If he were to do that and just put up what kind of passing numbers you would expect any decent quarterback to put up in the New England offense, you're talking borderline QB1, and it wouldn't take much of an upgrade there, either in the passing game or getting a little more rushing production, maybe a couple of extra touchdowns, to suddenly vault him into 8th or 9th or 10th in quarterback points. And yet he's sitting here being drafted as a mid-tier QB2. I'm looking at it going, people, I understand that, he might not fit into the Belichick scheme. You think so? But if you're looking at the paths to get to that point, he's got a lot of paths there. In fact, I've got him in an upside grade in my draft guide as the number 9 quarterback. And at QB2, at the QB2 tier, you don't have many quarterbacks that can get to that level. So really like we can get on Newton this year.
So what surprised me, though, based on everything you're saying about Cam Newton, is how down you evidently are on Josh Allen.
I am, because Allen here's the thing on Allen. So we've got the rushing production. I mentioned that you got to have the passing production too. But if I'm looking at Allen's rushing production, I'm going, okay, well, that's an up or down metric. I really like a lot of consistency in my quarterbacks. I don't want somebody who's going to give me 23 points one week and then 8 the next, because, yeah, the 23 might help me get a win, but the 8 might help me get a loss. So I really want consistency. He has trouble in that consistency area. But the big problem I had there is that people think that their passing offense is going to get so much better, because Josh Allen finished next to last per Sports Info Solutions in vertical yards per attempt. Just one of the worst vertical passers in the league. And that's where you're throwing the ball 11 or more yards downfield. He's very terrible. And so they bring in Diggs. And everybody says, well, Diggs is going to be the solution. And you look at Diggs's vertical numbers last year, how well he did on vertical passes. He had tremendous numbers, top 10 in targets, receptions, I think yards per attempt. There's a number of categories where Diggs was a very good vertical receiver. But if you start looking at him over the course of his career, and you look at 2019 compared to the rest of his career, 2019 is an outlier. And Diggs was motivated as heck to get out of Minnesota. He wanted to put up numbers so that they could move him, and he did. Now, he doesn't have that motivation, and I think we're going to go see the usual Josh Diggs, or Stephon Diggs. And if we see the usual Stephon Diggs, and he puts up the numbers that he did before, he's not going to upgrade the passing game. And in fact, all it would take is one Diggs injury, and the Bills' offense is back to where it was last year. And when I'm looking at those numbers together, I'm saying I think Allen will do some things in the ground game, and I think he's going to be productive there. But I don't think the passing production is going to be enough to say I can rely on him consistently as my QB1. That's why I've got him in the QB2 tier, because I just don't trust the consistency.
Before we get into a bunch of guys you like that are still undervalued, because I like that. I like trying to get those guys in my drafts, which is awesome. I should mention that some of these guys look like they'd be awesome for DFS as well. And the place I play DFS, DraftKings, there are 100 million reasons why you should listen up right now. The leader in one-day fantasy sports, yes, DraftKings, is giving away up to $100 million in prizes to all of their customers, including one lucky winner who will take home a $1 million cash prize. Here's what's amazing. Just download the app and sign up using promo code Ross. Then enter DraftKings free, you hear me, free football survivor pool. Yeah, it's really free. And yeah, you really can win a $1 million cash prize. Unbelievable. Download the DraftKings app now and use promo code Ross to claim your share of $100 million in instant giveaways and put yourself in the running for the $1 million cash top prize. It's promo code Ross to get your share of $100 million in prizes only at DraftKings. And I'm not talking about the Sportsbook app. I'm talking about the normal DraftKings app. Eligibility restrictions apply, but I think almost every state's legal. If they're not, they should be. See DraftKings.com for details. See Casey Joyner at Casey Joyner TFS for more details on undervalued. I'm going to call this undervalued row. Okay, Casey? And
okay.
We'll go with Teddy Bridgewater in Carolina.
Teddy Bridgewater, when he came out of in the draft, He passed 6 out of 7 of what are called the Parcells rules. Parcells rules are the rules that Bill Parcells came up with when he was in the NFL deciding who he should draft a quarterback. And I had somebody who had, and the only rule that Bridgewater didn't pass out of those 7 rules was that he wasn't a senior. And I had an ability to get in touch with Parcells. So I asked him, well, Bridgewater graduated, so wouldn't that count as the 7th rule? And he said, yeah, since he graduated, I would give him the idea of having been a senior. So Bridgewater passes all 7 of the Parcells rules. When you look at the history of people who pass all 7 of those rules, they have the percentage of players who reach elite levels in the NFL is pretty significant. It's like a tremendous number of quarterbacks who pass all 7. So he has the injury. He has some, he doesn't reach that level yet. But when you get down to Carolina right now is stocking up on wide receivers. When you look at the roster composition right now, they're stocking up on wide receivers. So I'm seeing a path of 600 passes. That's huge. He does a great job protecting the ball. He's done well in the metric I have called bad decision rate that measures how often the quarterback makes mental errors that leads to turnovers. So I think the turnover is going to be down. They upgraded the receiving core as well. So I really like that part of it. He will run the ball some, I think. He'll give you – he's not going to be Brady. He's not going to sit back there and give you 0. I think he'd get 150, 200 yards and a couple rushing touchdowns, maybe 3 or 4 if things go well. So I start to look at all that and say, well, he's in a pass-heavy offense. He's got good receivers. The schedule is not that unfavorable. He can give him more. He had the Parcells rules that show you he has elite talent. I keep adding these up. I'm going, okay, this is a guy I like as a QB2. I don't know if he's going to be a QB1, but in a 2 QB league, I absolutely want him. And I think he's going to have some very good games. He's in a division where you're going to get a lot of high-scoring contests. You get against Tampa, you get against Atlanta. I mean, these are games you're probably going to get high-scoring contests. I start adding these together. I'm like, I'm going to bet that I wouldn't mind having Bridgewater in my lineup in half the games this season. And if that's the case, he should be a valuable QB2. And yet again, people are thinking him as maybe a low-end QB2 in a lot of drafts. He's not even being taken. So a great pickup in the waiver wires in a lot of drafts too.
Now you got a couple running backs that are undervalued. The next one's interesting because people are really high on him, and it seems like they're valuing him really high. So I'm curious how you're going to tell me that Miles Sanders from the Eagles is still undervalued.
He's undervalued. I think he's got good value in PPR leagues, but the ADPs I'm seeing in standard leagues, he's on the borderline of RB1 and RB2. And, okay, he's probably going to be the lead back. I don't know if he'll quite be a bell cow, but I can easily see the path to 300 touches. So, okay, he's got that down. He did very well in the last quarter of the year last year in a metric I have called good blocking yards per attempt. It's a metric I've been tracking for over a decade now. Good blocking yards per attempt measures how productive a ball carrier is when you give him quality run blocking. If you can get into the 9-yard or higher category here, or 9-yard or higher range here, you're in the elite range here. He was at 9.1 in the second or the last 4 games of the year. So he's at that level. League average is usually about 7.9. So, but if you're in that 9 to 10 range, if you can get in that area, you're going to be at elite production when they give you quality run blocking. The Eagles have a very good offensive line. I know they got to make some changes there. Peters came back, so take the place of Brooks. So they've got only a couple of people they need to replace, and I still think they're going to have strong run blocking. The schedule is quite favorable too. So I see Sanders in all environments because he's a breakaway back and a lead back who could be a bell cow. He's on that border. When you start adding those factors together with what I think is going to be good run blocking and a quality schedule, and I mentioned fireworks points, the NFC East has, as a division, the highest fireworks points total in the league. So I think there are going to be a lot of high-scoring games in that division. Add those factors together, I think he ought to be probably a mid-tier QB1 or RB1 in every environment. And again, in standard, he's being taken closer to an RB1, RB2. He's up at a 12, 13 level. And in PPR leagues, he's only being drafted 9th, and I think he's got upside higher than that. So I do think he's maybe not terribly undervalued, but yeah, I think he's undervalued in a lot of leagues.
All right, so then you've got another running back in the state of Pennsylvania, but the other side of the state, and that's James Conner. A lot of people really down on Conner, primarily because he just can't stay healthy, but you still like him.
I still like him a lot for a number of reasons. One of the things you see with Pittsburgh over the years is every few seasons, Pittsburgh will say, we're going to go pass happy. For whatever reason, they get away from being who the Steelers are. It's happened a few times, happened under Tomlin a couple of times now, and that happened in 2018. They got really pass happy. And then 2019, obviously, they couldn't get past that because Roethlisberger gets hurt. But I thought last year they were going to get back to a more run-heavy approach. I think this year they're going to continue to get to a more run-heavy approach, especially with the reports now that Roethlisberger's arm may not look quite as good of late. It looks like he's getting a little banged up, like he's not throwing as well on deep passes per a report from The Athletic. So they're not going to be a pass-heavy team. They're going to be more run-heavy team. Pittsburgh has the most favorable matchup point schedule in the ground game among any team in the league, so they've got an incredibly favorable schedule. Connor's in a contract year, and Tomlin has said repeatedly, I want to have a bell cow back. He showed it with Le'Veon Bell. He wants to have a guy who's going to be the guy. They've got some talent in the backfield. They got Snell. They've got McFarland. They've got some talent behind him, but I think they want him to play well. And being in a contract year, I think Connor's a guy who will be motivated by that. So I think he's going to get lead back bell cow production. I think he's going to be on the border between being a bell cow back and what I call a lead back, which is where you don't get quite all the carries, but you get most of them. So he's going to be at that level. He's going to get that kind of production. And I think he's going to catch plenty of passes too. So I've got him, even with those factors, I could see a path for him to be a low tier to mid tier RB1, but I've got him ranked right on the border of RB1, RB2. But I'm looking at ADP levels. He's getting drafted as an RB2/RB3. He's like 22, 23. So depending on if you're a 10 or 12 team league, he might be lasting into the third round. That's just ridiculous for what kind of upside he can offer. And I love it from that sense in that because he's that type of a bat, because where he's at there, you can draft him to his floor. I love the idea of drafting a guy and saying, if I draft him as a 2, he might give me 1 production, but I know he's going to probably give me 2 production. If you can get people at that level where you're drafting to their floor and that's where they're going to be, and everything above, everything from there is going to be upside play, I love those kinds of players. So he'd be a favorite guy. If I could get him as my RB2, I would be thrilled.
Love it. All right. And what about Calvin Ridley? I thought was interesting.
Calvin Ridley is, I just don't understand why. Again, he's another one of those high floor, high ceiling players where you look at his production on a yards per attempt basis, a vertical yards per attempt basis, and what I call stretch vertical yards per attempt basis, stretch vertical being when you're throwing the ball 20 or more yards downfield. You start looking at Calvin Ridley's production in that area, in those areas, and he's highly consistent. And he's one of those guys to where, again, if things go well for him, would anybody be surprised if he was a low-tier wide receiver 1? In fact, if things went really well, if he might be wide receiver 10, wide receiver 9, I don't think anybody would be surprised. And you start to see his draft levels, and his ADP levels are lower than that, significantly lower than that. So, again, I like the idea of taking a player and saying, if I draft you at this level, that's going to be where, that's going to be your floor, where if things go badly for you, if you have just an average year, let's say, that's where you're going to be. And Ridley in that offense, again, I expect the NFC South, they were second in that fireworks points category for divisions. They were second in that category as far as fireworks. So they're going to be a lot of high-scoring games. I think when you get him in contest against the Panthers and you get him in contest against the Bucks, you're going to see those high-scoring contests. You're going to see them throwing the ball a lot. And I think he's going to be a wide receiver 2 who can give you wide receiver 1 production. So it's something I cover on my site, is that's a draft strategy that people should use, is always draft to the floor. And I think Ridley's a perfect example of that.
So the last thing I wanted to ask you about is actually a position group, and it's tight ends. And I thought it's perfect timing because on yesterday's Fantasy Feast podcast, the final tiers of Dolan position group was tight end. So we went over Joe's tight end tiers. And it sounds to me like just in general, you think tight ends are undervalued?
This year, I think tight ends, it's an interesting thing because I've got I do color-coded grading for my players, my draft guide, and blue is elite, green is a strong starter, yellow is an average starter, or a good starter, solid starter, and then if you get to orange or red, you're starting to get the players you don't want in your roster except for in really deep environments. I have 4 blue-rated tight ends. That would be Kelsey, Andrews, Kittle, and Ertz. I have 2 green-rated tight ends in Gronk and Waller. That's it. Once you're from there and their overall grades, everybody else is a yellow-rated grade or lower. They do have green-rated upside grades. I mentioned that that was a category that players could have, is that if things go well, you could be there. So there's a lot of depth from that perspective, and you can say, okay, well, I'm going to draft a couple of people who aren't one of those top 6. If I don't get one of those 6 I mentioned, I can draft those guys and hope that they could give me TE1 upside, but I'm not going to expect that they're going to give me TE1 upside. But if you want, I don't want to say guaranteed production, but if you want to play the percentages to say I want a guy who I know is going to be starter caliber player, you better get one of those top 6 tight ends, because after that, I don't want to say it's a crapshoot, but it's you're taking much higher risk in those players. And I think that if you don't get those players, there's some value players that you could take that include Noah Fant, Hunter Henry, who has the best matchup points total among tight ends. And I love Ian Thomas. He's the Carolina tight end, and I think they're going to be throwing the ball a lot in that offense, as we talked about earlier. Thomas has a favorable schedule. And Thomas, if you look at the games where he started 9 games of the past couple of seasons, and in his top 3 games, his numbers in those games were tremendous. He was putting up, I believe it was 12 fantasy points per game in standard leagues. I mean, the guy put up some fantastic numbers. I don't expect that to happen on a consistent basis. I don't think you're going to get that out of him every week. But if that offense is as pass happy as it looks like it's going to be, and he is the starting tight end in that offense, and everything points in that direction, if those factors go together, he could be at 75 to 100 targets. And if he gets at that level, that would automatically almost put him in the TE1 range, even if he doesn't reach those production levels that he reached in those 3 games.
Here's what you need to do. You need to get more information from this guy is what you need to do. You need to check him out on Twitter at KCJoynerTFS. Give him the website again, KC.
The website is thefootballscientist.com. I've got my paid subscription service that includes my 2020 draft guide, 400 pages of information, 150 player write-ups. You've got all the matchup charts. You've got the cheat sheets for every position. And if listeners and viewers want to use the discount code Ross, they'll get 10% off any discount or any paid subscription.
Love it. Love it, KC. Great stuff. Awesome interview. I've got a bunch of clips now for intern Casey. Different Casey, not you, Casey, Penn State student, CASEY. That'll be all over our YouTube page, youtube.com/RossTuckerNFL, and all over social media, at RossTuckerNFL, at RossTuckerPod. If you like what you heard from Casey, you'll love Greg Cosell tomorrow, kind of the same mold, of the same ilk. Guys that just have the sickness and the disease. They love football. Thank you, Casey.
Appreciate it, Ross.
That'll do it for this edition of the Fantasy Feast podcast. That was awesome. I love that we do 2 a week these days. Season's going to be here before you know it. Get excited, everybody. It is happening. Other than that, I'm stuffed. We're done.
Thanks for listening to the Fantasy Feast podcast. Make sure to also subscribe to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, Business of Sports, and the College Draft. All available at Apple Podcasts, rosstucker.com, or wherever podcasts can be found.